Hello folks, Luke Simons with you here. Glendive Dinosaur Museum. From a Christian point of view, you are going to love this video. It is a long video. I was debating cutting it up in different sections, but if you have a little bit of time, this is worth your time. Very, very accurate account of what happened in the time of the flood. Now, granted, I wasn't there, neither were you, but I think this is a good picture. Have fun. Thanks for watching. If you like these videos, please subscribe and hit that thumbs up.
What this exhibit does is it gives insight into the way our whole museum is set up, really. The very bottom layer of the fossil record is found in the seafloor exhibit, and that's the first layer, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. But when God created everything, what does the Bible say? He created it all perfect. Yeah, perfect. It says very good, right? It's not just good, but very good. There was no issues of death, no issues of disease, no issues of anything like that, according to what the Bible describes. Now, here's something interesting that I want to point out, and we don't have it out on display, but we have a bone out down in the lab. And this dinosaur bone has evidence of bone disease. Possibly bone cancer that ate away the ball of the joint on the femur. You know, there's supposed to be a ball there. The ball's gone, and it was eaten away. And it wasn't. There's no teeth marks. There's nothing like that. It appears that that bone was like that in life, and so it was a crippled dinosaur. So here's an interesting question for people. When we get to Genesis 1, towards the end of Genesis 1, when it says that everything is very good, that God created everything very good, do you think there was disease? It would be hard to imagine that there would be disease, right?
Right.
So there are some Christians that they bring in the millions of years and the Bible and try to marry them together and say, well, okay, let's try and take it all in, okay? And there's a problem with that diseased bone. Do you see a problem? If that bone is part of the fossil record, and according to evolutionary science, that's millions of years before humans ever came on the planet, right, then that means disease existed before humans, so therefore disease existed before sin. Who would be the creator of disease then? God would, right? Mm-hmm. And that's not right. That's not what the Bible teaches. So there's a theological problem if you try to bring together long ages and the Bible into one. I mean, the only way for it to work, and I'm not just trying to make up something to make it work, right, but it just shows that this is a bigger issue than just some dinosaur bones in the ground. I mean, there is actually what we believe about God is at stake, right, in that. So when he created everything very good, we know that Adam and Eve disobeyed God. They were given a choice because he gave humans free will. He gave them the ability to choose whether to follow him, obey him, or to disobey him. They chose to disobey. And immediately, some things started happening. Death entered the world. People became, over the generations, more and more corrupt and evil till one day, it says in the Bible that people thought about evil all the time. Doesn't seem a whole lot different than today in a lot of ways, right? Right. And so when that happened, then God chose to flood the earth. Now, where did the rain, or where did the floodwaters come from?
Fountains of the deep.
Okay, yeah, a lot of people think the rains came down and the floods came up. The rains came down and the floods came up. The rain was really a byproduct of the flood, not the cause of the flood. It contributed, obviously, but it was not the primary mechanism of flooding the earth. They've even found today huge reservoirs of water under the crust of the earth. So if the fountains of the deep, which would have been under the ocean surface, if God would have broken open the crust and all this water begins to pour out, which was under extreme pressure, and spew out, causing huge tsunami waves of sediment and water. Now, would this water have been cold or warm, do you think? It's under the crust of the earth. What's that?
Boiling.
Yeah, probably pretty hot. It's going to raise the temperature of the ocean. It's going to do all sorts of things. So now you're going to have changes in the atmosphere. You're going to have major storms, superstorms swirling. Also, when you break open the crust of the earth, what else is going to happen? You're going to have volcanoes.
Yeah.
You're going to have all sorts of things taking place during this time when God is opening up the crust of the earth. Now, the fossil record is either a record of millions of years or it's a record of a huge catastrophe that happened on the earth. In order to get fossils, you need a huge catastrophe to take place. Fossils don't form when something just dies on the side of a creek and just slowly gets buried over time and then fossilized. What happens to that? It'll decay, right? Even bone decays.
Yep.
Not everything that dies turns into a fossil. So you need to be buried very quickly in order for something to be turned into a fossil. So the fountains of the deep, huge tsunami waves of sediment and water begin to move towards land. What are the first things that are going to be buried? Well, we know anything that gets buried is stuff that just couldn't get out of the way, right?
Plants and
Things on the bottom of the ocean floor. You're going to have that seafloor exhibit that we have down there. That's the Cambrian layer. That's the very bottom layer of the fossil record that has fossils in it. There's Precambrian rock, but there's really no fossils to speak of. There might be a worm here, you know, like a hole for a worm or something like that in that kind of rock. But the first layer, what we would consider the first layer of the flood, would be the Cambrian layer. And according to evolutionary science, or evolutionary thought, and I'm not even going to call it science, evolutionary thought is that the bottom layer is a representation of the beginnings of life on Earth. Well, it's very complex life, from the trilobite and to the Anomalocaris, and I mean, all those things that are in that seafloor are very complex creatures, and they're varied. You have soft-bodied creatures and hard-shelled creatures.
Right.
All these great varieties in this one layer that just, boom, all of them appear out of nowhere. So from an evolutionary perspective, it doesn't make sense.
Yeah,
I
that's
mean,
a good point.
all of a sudden, boom, it pops up out of nowhere. But from a flood perspective, it makes sense.
right.
They're the first things. They were bottom-dwelling, shallow-living sea creatures that were buried as the tsunami waves went towards land. And that's exactly what we see. We see that very bottom layer, and we see those kind of creatures buried in that spot. So let's go around over here. As these waves reach the land, what's the first thing that it's going to take down that can't run? That's exactly right. Somebody the other day was like, snakes, they can't run. I'm like, well, yeah, okay, I understand. But, I mean, the trees aren't going to run away, right? Unless it's Lord of the Rings or something like that. But the water is going to take down the vegetation and the insects and things like that and begin to lay that down. That's the exact next layer, of predominant layer you see is the Carboniferous layer with trees and vegetation and all sorts of things like that buried, again, very quickly. It has to be buried very quickly in order for it to be fossilized. Out on the ranch that I live on, it's a treasure trove of fossils. There are dinosaur bones and there is petrified logs. One log that we found, it goes into the hillside. It is petrified and actually agatized in spots, and then when you get down deeper, it's coalified on one spot, and then guess what's right underneath that? Original wood. It hasn't even been fossilized in any way, shape, or form. It's just wood. The only thing that would explain that is, one, that it's not very old, that it didn't get buried all that long ago. And in order for you to get processes like that going on, it has to be buried very quickly. So as these tsunami waves hit the continent, probably a continent at this time, right? It begins to bury the vegetation next. And then as we go around, then let's go ahead and go over here to the next one. There's a lot of theories on the plants and the trees and different things like that. Like how did you get these big layers of trees? There was probably floating log mats, and there were other things that took place during all of that as well. But as the water begins to go further and further up on land, what is everything trying to do? Get to higher ground. Yeah, I mean, it's trying to escape, right? I mean, that would make sense. It's going to move as quickly as possible to higher ground. What are the things that are going to survive? Now, not anything that's slow moving. Did you know that once you get past some of the tree layers, and again, one thing I want you to understand is these are not perfect layers. These are not like this you have these animals here and you have these animals here. There is a jumbled mess in some of this as well. Right. But this is generally what you find in these different layers. Once you get past the carboniferous layers, you get to a layer that has your big slow-moving sauropod dinosaurs like Argentinosaurus. You have other ones that probably lived along the edge of the water. And so they're not going to get to move that quickly. They're probably not going to think to move as the water and the sediment now hits them and begins to bury those creatures. Now, some creatures are going to try and get to higher ground. Some creatures are going to swim. Did you know that elephants are great swimmers? Mm-hmm. They used to talk about historically, if you were on a ship and there were elephants on that ship, and if it went down, find an elephant, because it can take you long distances and you might survive. Because that thing just has to kind of buoy there under the surface of the water, right? Mm-hmm. And what does it have to stick up in order to breathe? Its trunk, right? That's it. So it could breathe and it could keep moving. Now, are you going to find fossilized elephants? Probably not. And the reason is because, again, they're going to float, and then what's going to happen to those elephants? Eventually they're going to die. Yeah. They're going to get eaten by the mosasaurs and the megalodon sharks that are swimming around in the water, destroying all of that. And the only thing that gets buried is that which is unable to escape. Right. And I think dinosaurs, here, because a lot of people ask this question, so why so many dinosaur bones? Well, there could be a lot of different reasons. One of the reasons we say here is the density of the bone. That's possible, but it's not the whole story, because some dinosaurs have hollow bones. So you can't just say density of the bone. I think the best explanation, this is just, again, I wasn't there. Mm-hmm. It doesn't describe it this way in the Bible, but it makes sense. I think pre-flood, I think the areas that along the coast and all of that, I think they were populated by dinosaurs primarily. Mm-hmm. I think there were a lot of dinosaurs. I think the environment was such that they survived better than a lot of creatures. In fact, they've been able to take amber. See, there's a chunk of amber right over there. Yep. They've been able to take amber and extract air out of the amber and find that in the past, there was more oxygen in the atmosphere than there is today. Right. So that would explain dragonflies with 3-foot wingspans. Mm-hmm. That would explain, some people even think that explains T-Rex, because you look at the chest cavity of a T-Rex, the lungs wouldn't have been really big enough to handle that size of creature unless oxygen levels were higher. Yep. Right?
Right, yeah.
So pre-flood, I think the atmosphere was more conducive to certain types of creatures that we find in the fossil record. Now post-flood, everything changes.
Right.
Atmosphere's different, environment's different. Now, I think it was good that you asked that question about the seeds, because one thing I never really thought about was think about all the plants that went extinct during the flood. Maybe some of the things that animals had to live on to make them larger or whatever, make them live longer. And so post-flood now, everything's different. Right. And so now you have the age of the mammals. I think we can agree with the evolutionist in the sense that there was kind of an age of the dinosaur, and there was an age of the mammal. Mm-hmm. But we're not talking about millions of years of time. We're talking about pre-flood,
Yeah, right.
post-flood, and because of the environment. Again, I
Right.
wasn't there. I don't know for sure, but it makes sense because we
Right.
do find a lot of dinosaur bones as opposed to mammal bones. But again, mammals, what are humans going to do? You know, if I'm a human and this happens, now see, I'm not very, you know, you guys all look like you guys could probably be homesteaders, and you guys probably have, you could probably build log rafts and strap them together and survive just fine. I'm one of these guys that I'd be begging you to let me on your raft that you made. Please, let me on. Don't you think humans are going to do stuff like that?
Right.
Build rafts, they're going to go to higher ground, they're going to try everything they can to avoid the flood. The other proposal that people have is why don't we find human bones in the fossil record is that the human population was probably further inland. They didn't necessarily live on the coast. We don't find any reference to oceans pre-flood in the Bible. We don't know for sure, but that's a possible explanation. So as the waters rose, they wouldn't have been part of all that fossil making action
Right.
that would have been going on along the coast as much. Does that make sense? So that's probably why you don't have a lot of humans either. Now again, what was the purpose of the flood? To wipe humanity off the face of the earth, other than those preserved on the ark.
That's right.
So that's the other aspect of
Right.
it, a theological point, that God's purpose was to wipe them out. I think even any memory of humanity at that point as well. So you see our artist's sense of humor with a pterosaur here with a person in its mouth. Did you see that?
Yeah,
I don't
I
know if you
did.
saw that last time.
Like the bird.
The entire earth is being reshaped. Because if you have the fountains of the deep opening up, you have cracks in the crust of the earth, and you're going to have volcanic activity going on, mountains being formed, valleys being lowered, and you're going to have these huge cracks that are going to begin to develop possibly volcanic activity causing volcanic mountains. You're going to have all sorts of action taking place where you're going to have these, like this plate and this plate, one heaving up over another. Have you ever been to, I was just over in the Canadian Rocky Mountains, and those Rocky Mountains, I mean, they're just bare. So you're looking at them and you can see the layers, like some sitting like this, some sitting like this. And so post-flood, all that stuff has taken place, and you've got all this different mountain building mechanisms going on. And then you also have a lot of redistribution of fossils, so you're going to have things churned up and relayed down. On our dig site that we take people to, and this is not just an advertisement for our digs, but you know, if you ever want to go on a dig, we do have digs. But on our dig site, in one area, we find everything from shark teeth to alligator scute, which is like the armor of an alligator, to turtle shell, to dinosaur bones, to figs, to sequoia cones, all in the same area, buried very quickly. And that just is all churned up and laid down. It fits a flood.
Right.
People have said, well, the earth looks old. I had a guy that I was talking to that goes, it just looks old. I can't get over how old it looks. And I'm like, first of all, well, what does that mean? I mean, that's a very relative term. I mean, how do you know how old something is just by looking at it? And the other aspect is this. It looks flooded.
Right.
If you were to take and you were to go over to Mount St. Helens and look at some of the land there that had huge waves of mud and water going down that mountain, burying things and all of that. And if you look at it now, there's a lot of the spots that look very rugged, there's canyons that were formed in very short periods of time. It was a catastrophe on a small scale, really, that did all of that. Think about what the flood would have done and the way it's described in Scripture. So, and in Williston, North Dakota, they're thousands of feet below the surface. Because people ask that, it's like, well, you know, why are they that way? Well, we live here in Glendive on the edge of the Cedar Creek anticline. Now, this is not really a picture of an anticline because this is more volcanic mountain building, because you have more volcanic activity going on here. An anticline is where you take the layers, the sedimentary layers, there's pressure on the sides, and it causes them to bow. And then it can also cause a syncline, which is where it dips down, okay? So you have that pressure, causes it to bow, and then it erodes, and it exposes layers that you don't find somewhere else, okay? Like in Williston, like I said, they're there. It's just you're gonna have to dig a long time to get to them. And we happen to live on the edge of the Cedar Creek anticline, which exposes what's called the Hell Creek Formation, which is where you find a lot of dinosaur bones. And so that's why you find them here. That's why we can walk around on the ranch and we can pick up little pieces of dinosaur bone. There's spots where we walk and we look down and we're standing all over dinosaur bone, just littered all over the place. So that's why it exposes that. Other places, glaciers have come down and destroyed all of the dinosaur bones. There aren't any because they've just been churned to dust. So that's why here you find dinosaur bones right on the surface. Now, so what did we determine about the water coming up from the crust of the earth? Warm, right? Hot, probably. It's going to raise the temperature of the ocean. You're going to have superstorms, and we believe you're going to have an ice age.
Right.
And not multiple ice ages, but one ice age. Honestly, an ice age that we're still recovering from. If you look at the data, you want to call it global warming or whatever, but we are still in a sense moving away from that time when there was an ice age. So there's a lot of different variation in the weather, and there's cycles and all sorts of stuff like that. Any change in the environment like that is not necessarily man-made. It's something that is a result, I think, of the flood, ultimately, that we're still dealing with today. Now, ice age. When you get above all of those flood layers, now you're going to have things that are going to get buried in boggy areas like mastodons, mammoths. You're going to get things distributed all over the earth from the ark. And did you know they can trace the elephant kind back to genetically, and this is from evolutionary scientists, back to where the ark landed.
Really?
They can trace them genetically back to that spot.
Wow.
We're going to have a display right here where we have our Ice Age map where we show the distribution of animals from the ark. We're going to look at dinosaurs. We're going to look at the elephant kind. Here's a cool thing. Did you realize that they've genetically been able to look at cats, domestic cats, and trace them not back to Egypt, where everybody thinks that's where it started, or China, but to the plains of Shinar, where they built the Tower of Babel. Does that make sense? Think about it. People are now scattered, Tower of Babel, all over the world during the Ice Age. And what are they going to take with them? Kitty, right? They're going to take their cats with them all over the world, and they can trace them genetically back to basically the general area where the Tower of Babel was built.
Wow.
Again, confirmation for the Bible being an actual history of the world. And we're going to have a people distribution map right over here where we have exhibit under construction. We're going to have a map showing people moving all over the place too, post Tower of Babel. Now, people wonder how the animals got all over the world when you've got oceans in the way, right? Well, if a lot of the water from the flood was tied up in ice, are the oceans going to be higher or lower? Lower, right? So if the oceans are lower, you're going to have land exposed that isn't exposed today, and land bridges, the ice is going to help with that as well. And so when the animals disperse from the ark and begin to multiply, they're going to spread out all over the earth, a lot of it based on where they environmentally want to live. You know, you're going to have longer-haired animals and animals that can handle the cold, staying up in the snow. You're going to have some that are going to head more down south where it's warmer. And so as the snow melts, what happens to the oceans? Raise, and then you're going to have isolation in spots, right? So the same is true for humans. They're going to move all over the world based on just where they end up deciding to settle post Tower of Babel. And so again, here's the bottom line. Everything we talk about in the museum here is based on a historical question, not so much what we would call a scientific question. Can you take a moment in history and reproduce it in a lab?
Absolutely
You
not.
can't, right? I mean, impossible. We all know that. But what are we told over and over and over again? That evolutionary origins have been scientifically proven, and if you believe science, you're going to believe evolution. But again, evolutionary origins, that is a historical perspective that cannot be reproduced in a lab.
Mm-hmm.
So what we're presenting here is the fact that we believe that the Bible is true, that you can trust the Bible, that it's an accurate historical book from the archaeological evidences that are found, to the paleontological evidences that are found, to geological evidences. All of it makes sense based on the history of the Bible. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay. Anybody have any questions? I have lots of questions. So.
Now we got it all figured out.
Interestingly, those domestic cats too is to that general area. I find that incredible because that again confirms scripture.
Yeah, I'm surprised the cat survived. If Noah would have had sons like me, they would have been target practice.
Wow.
Kitten cannon.